The storm arrives without warning, tearing across the North Sea with a fury that seems almost alive. Rain hammers the ancient coastline of East Anglia, where chalk cliffs stand defiant against waves that have crashed against them for millennia. The wind howls through narrow village lanes, rattling windows and doors, while the sea churns black and violent beneath a moonless sky. This is the kind of night when sensible folk bolt their doors, draw their curtains tight, and pray for morning light. But on nights like these, when the boundary between our world and something older grows thin, there are those who claim to see something moving through the fog. Something that shouldn't exist, yet has terrorized these coastal paths for centuries beyond counting. What stalks the fog-shrouded lanes of East Anglia when darkness falls? Ask the farmers who refuse to cross certain fields after sunset. Ask the fishermen who've abandoned their boats mid-voyage, their faces drained of color, speaking in hushed tones of eyes that burned like coals in the maritime mist. Ask the families who've passed down warnings through generations, tales that predate written record, stories of a beast so terrible that its very name is spoken with dread. They call it Black Shuck, the devil's own hound, wandering the borderlands between the living and the damned. Picture, if you will, a creature emerging from the sea mist on a desolate coastal path. First, the eyes appear, glowing crimson in the darkness, hovering at the height of a man's chest. Then the shape materializes, massive beyond belief, a dog the size of a calf. Its fur blacker than the surrounding night. Its footfalls are silent despite its enormous size, yet witnesses report feeling the ground tremble as it passes. Some say its breath steams in the cold air, reeking of brimstone and decay. Others claim it makes no sound at all, this phantom that moves like smoke through the hedgerows and country lanes. At dawn, after the creature has vanished with the retreating darkness, there is evidence. Massive paw prints pressed deep into wet sand, far larger than any natural dog could leave. Tracks that appear on beaches where no living soul ventured during the night hours. Prints that lead from nowhere and end abruptly, as if whatever made them simply dissolved into air. This is no ordinary ghost story, no fireside tale meant to frighten children into obedience. Black Shuck represents something far more ancient and malevolent, a terror that reaches back into the pagan past of these islands, before Christianity brought its crosses and churches to these shores. This is a creature of Old England, of the wild places where Roman legions feared to tread, where ancient Britons made offerings to gods whose names are now forgotten. The encounters span centuries. Medieval monks recorded sightings in their chronicles, describing a demonic apparition that burst through church doors during services. Victorian gentlemen, men of reason and science, fled in terror from fog-bound roads, abandoning their carriages and horses. In our own modern age, with all our electric lights and rational explanations, people still report seeing those burning eyes in the darkness, still refuse to walk certain paths after the sun goes down. The legend has left its mark on the landscape itself. Villages bear names that reference the beast. Ancient warning stones stand at crossroads. Churches display claw marks on their wooden doors. Gouges that locals insist were made centuries ago by something desperate to reach the terrified congregation within. What we're about to explore together is a journey through time and terror. We'll trace this demon's path through history, following its bloody trail across the English countryside. We'll stand in the places where it appeared, examine the evidence it left behind, and hear from those who claim to have seen it with their own eyes. We'll delve into the darkest chapters of East Anglian history, where the line between legend and reality blurs until even the skeptics begin to wonder. From medieval churches to lonely marshlands, from fishing villages to country estates, Black Shuck has walked, leaving fear in its wake. And on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the mist rolls in from the sea, some say it walks still. In the fog-shrouded flatlands of eastern England, where the North Sea crashes against ancient shores and salt marshes stretch endlessly beneath gray skies, there exists a legend so persistent, so deeply rooted in the collective memory of the land, that even today, centuries after the first recorded sightings, locals will still cross themselves when speaking its name. The creature they call Black Shuck walks these coastal plains, a phantom hound of such terrible aspect that merely glimpsing it has driven men mad, brought forth unexplained deaths, and announced disasters yet to come. But to understand this harbinger of doom, to truly grasp why this particular specter has haunted East Anglia for more than 1,000 years, we must journey back to a time when the old gods still held sway, when the boundary between the living world and the realm of spirits was far thinner than it is today. The roots of Black Shuck stretch deep into the dark soil of pagan mythology, intertwining with belief systems that predated Christianity by centuries. When the Anglo-Saxons arrived on Britain's eastern shores during the 5th and 6th centuries, they brought with them a rich tapestry of folklore and supernatural beliefs inherited from their Germanic ancestors. Among these beliefs was the concept of spectral hounds, massive black dogs that served as guardians between worlds, as psychopomps leading souls to the afterlife, and as omens of impending death. These were not ordinary animals, but supernatural entities whose very existence challenged the natural order. The Norse influence on eastern England cannot be understated. When Viking raiders and settlers established the Danelaw across much of northern and eastern England during the 8th and 9th centuries, they brought their own mythological traditions, which merged and mingled with the existing Anglo-Saxon beliefs. In Norse mythology, the most fearsome of all hounds was Garmr, the blood-stained guardian of Hell's Gates, described in the poetic Edda as the greatest of all dogs. This beast stood watch at the entrance to the underworld, and during Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, Garmr would break free from his chains to fight alongside the forces of chaos. The similarities between Garmr and the later descriptions of Black Shuck are striking. Both are described as enormous black dogs. Both are associated with death and the boundary between life and the afterlife. And both inspire a primal, visceral terror in those who encounter them. But the mythological connections run even deeper. The Wild Hunt, known across Germanic and Norse cultures, featured prominently in the folklore of East Anglia. This spectral procession, led by Odin himself in Norse tradition, or by various other supernatural figures depending on the region, would ride across the night sky accompanied by a pack of ghostly hounds. To witness the Wild Hunt was to court disaster. Those who saw it might be swept up into the procession, doomed to ride with the dead for eternity, or they might simply drop dead on the spot from the sheer terror of the encounter. The hounds that ran with the Wild Hunt were described in terms remarkably similar to Black Shuck. Massive, black as midnight, with eyes that burned like coals or flames, and they moved with an eerie supernatural silence despite their great size. When Christianity spread across England, beginning in earnest during the 7th century, the old pagan beliefs did not simply vanish. The church was pragmatic in its approach to conversion, often incorporating or recontextualizing pagan traditions, rather than attempting to eradicate them entirely. The supernatural hounds of pagan mythology were too deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness to be simply forgotten. Instead, they were reinterpreted through a Christian lens. What had once been guardians of the underworld or members of Odin's hunt became demons, servants of Satan himself, hellhounds sent to claim the souls of sinners or to announce divine punishment. The very name Black Shuck reveals this transformation. Derived from the Old English word skaka, meaning demon or devil, the name itself carries the weight of Christian demonology. Yet the creature it describes remained fundamentally pagan in character. The church could rename the beast, could claim it for hell rather than hell, but it could not change the essential nature of the encounters, could not alter the descriptions that had been passed down through generations. This created a unique hybrid entity, neither fully pagan nor fully Christian, existing in a liminal space between two belief systems. The geographic concentration of Black Shuck sightings is itself revealing. East Anglia, particularly the counties of Norfolk and Suffolk, became the creature's primary hunting grounds, though sightings extended into Essex and parts of Cambridgeshire. This was not random. These coastal regions had been at the heart of both Anglo-Saxon and Norse settlement. The Danelaw's influence was strongest here, and the mixing of cultures most pronounced. Moreover, the landscape itself seemed to breed such legends. The flat, windswept coastline, the isolated villages connected by lonely country roads, the marshes where will-o'-the-wisps danced and strange lights appeared, the ancient churches standing solitary in the fields, all created an atmosphere where the supernatural felt close, tangible, real. The sea itself played a role. Coastal communities lived and died by the ocean's whims. Storms could arise without warning, drowning fishermen and flooding villages. The constant threat of death from the sea created a population attuned to omens and portents. When Black Shuck appeared on a lonely coastal road or materialized in a churchyard near the shore, it seemed to embody the ever-present danger that haunted these communities. The creature became associated with shipwrecks, with drownings, with the deaths of sailors and fishermen who ventured too far from shore. What makes the Black Shuck legend particularly compelling is the remarkable consistency of the descriptions across centuries and across different communities. Despite variations in local traditions, despite the lack of mass communication in medieval and early modern England, the accounts share striking similarities. Witnesses invariably describe a massive dog, typically black as night itself, though occasionally described as having shaggy fur. The size is consistently reported as being as large as a calf, or even larger, far exceeding any natural dog. The eyes are perhaps the most frequently mentioned feature. They glow with an unnatural light, described variously as burning red, fiery yellow, or blazing like hot coals. Some accounts specify that these eyes are as large as saucers, adding to the creature's unnatural appearance. The creature's movement is another consistent detail that defies natural explanation. Despite its massive size, Black Shuck moves in complete silence. Witnesses report hearing no sound as it approaches, no panting breath, no clicking of claws on stone or road. It simply appears, often materializing out of fog or darkness, and pads along with an eerie, soundless gait that violates every expectation of how such a large animal should move. This silence may be the most unsettling aspect of the encounters, as it removes the creature from the natural world entirely. A real dog, no matter how large, makes noise. Black Shuck's silence marks it as something other, something wrong, something that should not exist. The creature's role as an omen gives Black Shuck its most sinister dimension. This was not merely a frightening beast that might attack the unwary traveler. Instead, Black Shuck served as a harbinger, an announcement that death or disaster was approaching. To see the creature was to know that misfortune was coming, either to the witness themselves or to their family or community. Sometimes the death followed swiftly, within hours or days. Other times the curse seemed to linger, with disaster striking weeks or even months later. But the connection was understood and remembered. Black Shuck did not simply appear randomly. Its presence meant something, carried a message written in glowing eyes and silent footfalls. This ominous quality elevated Black Shuck beyond a simple monster or even a demon. It became a force of fate itself, an embodiment of the inevitable. You could not fight Black Shuck, could not reason with it or escape it once marked by its attention. The creature existed outside normal causality, appearing to announce what was already written, what had already been decided by forces beyond human understanding. This made it more terrifying than any mere predator could be. A wolf might be killed, a human attacker overcome, but Black Shuck represented something against which human strength and courage were meaningless. The theological implications troubled medieval and early modern clergy. If Black Shuck was a demon, did that mean God permitted demons to roam freely, marking innocence for death? If it was a natural creature, how to explain its supernatural qualities and prophetic nature? Some clergymen argued that Black Shuck was indeed diabolic, sent to tempt Christians into pagan superstition or to punish communities for hidden sins. Others suggested it might be a divine instrument, an angel of death clothed in fearsome form to inspire proper fear of God's judgment. Still others dismissed the accounts entirely as peasant superstition, though such dismissals did little to stop the stories or prevent new sightings. The persistence of the Black Shuck legend across so many centuries speaks to something fundamental in human psychology. The fear of death, the anxiety about the future, the desire to find meaning in random tragedy, all find expression in this spectral hound. Black Shuck transforms death from a random biological event into something with warning, with pattern, with meaning. If the creature appears before disaster, then disaster can be anticipated, prepared for, understood within a framework of supernatural logic. This may seem like cold comfort, but it represents humanity's eternal struggle to impose order on chaos, to find narrative structure in the random cruelties of existence. Today, In an age of electric lights and rational materialism, Black Shuck still walks the lonely roads of East Anglia. The sightings continue, though modern witnesses may frame them in different terms, may attribute them to trick of light or overactive imagination. But late at night, when fog rolls in from the North Sea and the old churches cast long shadows across empty fields, the legend endured. And perhaps, in the darkness beyond the streetlights, massive and silent and patient, something watches with eyes like burning coals, waiting to deliver its message to the next unfortunate soul who crosses its path. The morning of August 4th, 1577, began like any other summer Sabbath in the market town of Bungay, Suffolk. Parishioners rose early, dressed in their finest clothes, and prepared to attend services at St. Mary's Church, a magnificent structure that had stood watch over the town for centuries. But as they walked through the narrow streets toward the church, they could feel something wrong in the air. The sky, which should have been bright with August sunshine, had turned an ominous shade of gray. The wind carried an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into the bones of every person it touched. By the time the congregation had assembled inside St. Mary's, the weather had deteriorated dramatically. What had begun as an overcast morning had transformed into something far more threatening. Dark clouds roiled overhead, moving with unnatural speed and purpose. The wind howled through the streets of Bungay, rattling shutters and sending loose objects tumbling through the marketplace. Then came the thunder, deep and resonant, shaking the very foundations of the ancient church. The parishioners tried to focus on their prayers, but the storm demanded attention. Rain began to hammer against the stone walls and leaded windows with such force that it drowned out the voice of the priest. Lightning flashed with blinding intensity, casting stark shadows through the stained glass and illuminating the frightened faces of the worshippers. Some of the older members of the congregation would later recall that they had lived their entire lives in Suffolk and had never witnessed a storm of such ferocity. The Reverend Abraham Fleming, who would later document these events in his pamphlet titled A Strange and Terrible Wonder, described the storm as being of such violence that it seemed as though the very heavens were at war. The thunder, he wrote, was not the ordinary rumbling that accompanied summer storms, but rather a continuous, deafening roar that seemed to come from all directions at once. The lightning struck so frequently, and with such intensity, that the darkness of the storm-clouded morning was punctuated by moments of brilliant, almost painful illumination. Inside the church, the congregation huddled together, seeking comfort in numbers and in prayer. The elderly held their prayer books with trembling hands. Mothers clutched their children close. Strong men, who worked the fields and feared nothing that walked on two legs, found themselves whispering prayers they had not uttered since childhood. The priest raised his voice, attempting to lead his flock through psalms of protection and deliverance, but his words were lost in the chaos of the storm. Then, at the height of the tempest, something impossible happened. The heavy wooden doors of St. Mary's Church, which had been firmly closed against the storm, burst open with tremendous force. The wind rushed in, extinguishing candles and scattering prayer books, but it was not the wind that made the congregation scream. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the lightning-lit sky, was a creature that should not exist. It was a dog, but no ordinary dog that any person present had ever seen. Witnesses would later describe it as being the size of a large calf, with fur as black as midnight and eyes that glowed with an unholy red light. Some said those eyes burned like coals pulled fresh from a forge. Others insisted they looked like drops of molten metal, or like the flames of hell itself. The creature's presence seemed to fill the church with a palpable sense of dread that went beyond mere fear of a large animal. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the beast stood in the doorway, its massive head turning slowly as it surveyed the terrified congregation. Then it moved, and when it did, it moved with impossible speed. The creature bounded down the central aisle of the church, its claws clicking against the stone floor with a sound that cut through even the noise of the storm. As it ran, witnesses reported that the air itself seemed to shimmer around the beast, as though it generated some kind of intense heat. Two men knelt in prayer near the aisle, their heads bowed and their hands clasped. They never saw the creature coming. According to the accounts recorded in the parish records, both men fell dead instantly as the beast passed between them. There were no visible wounds on their bodies, no marks of teeth or claw. They simply collapsed where they knelt, as though the very life had been drawn out of them. Some witnesses claimed they saw scorch marks on the men's clothing, as though they had been struck by lightning. Others reported smelling sulfur and burnt flesh. The black dog did not stop. It continued its rampage through the church, racing between the pews as the congregation scattered in terror. Another parishioner, an elderly man whose name has been lost to history, was thrown to the ground with such force that his neck was broken. The beast moved through St. Mary's like a force of nature, or perhaps something darker, something supernatural that had been unleashed by the fury of the storm. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. It bounded toward the far end of the church and seemed to simply vanish, leaving behind a congregation in shock and 3 dead parishioners. But the beast had left other evidence of its passage. On the door through which it had entered, deep scorch marks appeared, blackened impressions in the wood that looked as though they had been burned into the surface by something impossibly hot. These marks, according to historical records and the testimony of numerous visitors over the centuries, remain visible on the church door to this very day. The news of what had happened at St. Mary's spread through Bungay with terrifying speed, but the creature's rampage was not yet finished. 7 miles to the southeast, in the village of Blythburgh, another congregation had gathered at Holy Trinity Church for Sunday services. They too were praying through the storm, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded in Bungay and completely unprepared for what was about to happen to them. The storm that raged over Blythburgh was, if anything, even more violent than what Bungay had experienced. The church itself seemed to tremble with each crack of thunder. Rain poured through gaps in the roof, and the wind howled through the ancient stonework like a living thing. The congregation at Holy Trinity Church pressed closer together, their prayers becoming more fervent as the storm intensified. Then the black dog appeared among them. Some witnesses said it materialized out of thin air, simply appearing in the middle of the church with no explanation for how it had entered. Others claimed they saw it bound through the door, moving so quickly that their eyes could barely follow its passage. However it arrived, the effect was the same. Absolute terror seized the congregation. The beast moved through Holy Trinity Church with the same terrible purpose it had demonstrated at St. Mary's. It raced along the aisles, between the pews, its massive form seeming to shimmer with heat and energy. As it ran, the creature struck down more victims. 2 men and a boy, according to the most reliable accounts, fell dead as the beast passed. Like the victims in Bungay, these unfortunate souls bore no obvious signs of attack. They simply died, their lives extinguished in an instant by something beyond natural understanding. But at Blythburgh, the creature left additional evidence of its passage. As it ran through the church, it raked its claws across the ancient door, leaving deep gouges in the wood. These marks were different from the scorch marks left at St. Mary's, but no less disturbing. They were far too deep and too large to have been made by any natural dog. They looked, according to those who examined them, as though they had been carved by something with immense strength and malevolent purpose. The church clock, which hung high on the wall, was also damaged during the creature's rampage. According to parish records, the mechanism was somehow disrupted, and witnesses reported seeing strange scorch marks on the clock face itself. Some claimed that lightning had struck the church at the exact moment the beast appeared, while others insisted that the creature itself had generated the electrical discharge that damaged the clock and left burn marks on various surfaces throughout the building. The Reverend Abraham Fleming, in his detailed account of these events, was careful to note the evidence that remained after the creature's attacks. He personally visited both churches and examined the physical marks left behind. His pamphlet, A Strange and Terrible Wonder, provides us with one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the incidents. Fleming described the claw marks at Blythburgh as being marvelously deep, and the scorch marks at Bungay as being most wonderfully impressed upon the wood. Fleming's account was not the only documentation of these events. Parish records from both St. Mary's Church in Bungay and Holy Trinity Church in Blythburgh contain entries describing the deaths that occurred on August 4, 1577. These records, maintained by the churches for official purposes, provide sober confirmation that something terrible did indeed happen on that stormy Sunday morning. While the parish records do not contain the vivid details found in Fleming's pamphlet, they do confirm the basic facts. Multiple parishioners died suddenly and violently during church services, and strange marks appeared on church property that could not be easily explained. The physical evidence remained for centuries as silent testimony to the events of that day. Visitors to both churches reported seeing the marks well into the modern era. At Blythburgh, the claw marks on the door became a source of dark fascination for locals and travelers alike. The door itself, ancient and weathered, bore gouges that seemed to have been made by something far larger and stronger than any ordinary animal. Attempts to explain these marks as the result of normal wear, damage from tools, or other mundane causes never quite satisfied those who saw them in person. The burn marks at St. Mary's Church in Bungay were equally disturbing. Scorch marks on wood will fade over time, affected by weather, age, and handling. Yet, according to accounts spanning multiple centuries, the marks left by the black dog remained clearly visible, dark impressions on the wood that seemed to resist the normal processes of decay and aging. Some visitors reported feeling an inexplicable sense of unease when touching the marked areas, as though some residue of the event still lingered in the physical material of the church itself. What are we to make of these events? The skeptical mind searches for rational explanations. Could the deaths have been caused by lightning strikes? Ball lightning is a rare but documented phenomenon that can enter buildings and cause injury or death. The violent storm certainly provided the conditions for unusual electrical activity. Perhaps the victims were killed by lightning, and the frightened, superstitious congregation interpreted what they saw through the lens of folklore and fear. But this explanation does not fully account for the consistency of the witness testimonies or the physical evidence that remained. Multiple witnesses at two different locations, 7 miles apart, all described seeing a massive black dog. They described its appearance, its movements, and its effects in remarkably similar terms. The deaths occurred in ways that did not match typical lightning strike injuries, and the marks left on the church doors, while possibly explainable through various natural or human causes, persisted in ways that seemed unusual. The events of August 4th, 1577, have never been conclusively explained. They remain, nearly 4.5 centuries later, as one of the most well-documented and disturbing supernatural incidents in English history. The combination of contemporary, written-in accounts, parish records, and lasting physical evidence sets these events apart from many other folklore tales. This was not simply a story told around fires and embellished with each retelling. This was something that people claimed to have witnessed, something that left marks on the physical world, something that killed real people whose deaths were recorded in official church documents. The concrete bunker still smelled of wet chalk and rust when Sergeant Harold Blackwood closed the heavy steel door behind him for his shift on the night of October 3rd, 1942. The sound echoed through the cramped observation post like the ceiling of a tomb. 6 feet of reinforced walls separated him from the howling wind that came straight off the North Sea, battering the Norfolk coast with a fury that seemed almost personal. Blackwood had been stationed at this lonely stretch of beach between Cromer and Munsley for 8 months, part of the coastal watch system designed to spot any German invasion force before it could establish a foothold on British soil. Every night followed the same routine. Light the paraffin lamp, check the observation log, scan the dark waters through the narrow viewing slit, and wait. Always waiting. At 43 years old, Blackwood was too old for frontline service, but his experience in the Great War had made him valuable for this kind of work. He knew how to watch without letting his mind play tricks. He understood the difference between imagination and reality, between shadows and threats. His commanding officer had commended him twice for his steady nerves and accurate reporting. In a job where false alarms could waste precious military resources and missed sightings could cost thousands of lives, Harold Blackwood had proven himself utterly reliable. His reports were clinical, precise, free from the exaggeration that plagued some of the younger watchers who saw Nazi paratroopers in every moving shadow. The war had been grinding on for 3 years now. The beaches along this stretch of Norfolk were strung with barbed wire, the roads dotted with concrete dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, the fields laced with hidden mines. Everyone knew an invasion could come at any moment. The Germans were just across that black expanse of water, and on nights like this, when the fog rolled in thick as wool and the moon hid behind endless clouds, Blackwood could almost feel them out there, planning, preparing, waiting for their moment. He poured himself tea from his thermos at just past midnight. The wind had picked up even more, and he could hear the waves crashing against the beach with tremendous force. The sound was constant, a deep rhythmic pounding that became almost hypnotic after hours of listening. Blackwood stood at his viewing slit, scanning the darkness with his binoculars, seeing nothing but varying shades of black. The sea, the sky. At 20 past 1 in the morning, something changed. Blackwood couldn't immediately identify what had caught his attention. Perhaps it was movement in his peripheral vision, or a brief break in the rhythm of the waves, or simply an instinct honed by months of vigilant watching. He lowered his binoculars and pressed his face closer to the narrow observation slit, trying to see the beach directly below his position. The bunker sat on a slight rise, giving him a vantage point over about 300 yards of shoreline in either direction. There was definitely something moving down there. Something large. Blackwood reached for his electric torch, a military-issue model with a powerful beam. He thumbed the switch and directed it down toward the beach. The cone of light cut through the darkness, illuminating wind-blown sand and tangled coils of barbed wire. He swept the beam slowly to the left, then froze. Two eyes stared back at him from the darkness. They reflected his torch beam with an intense amber-green luminescence, like twin lanterns suddenly ignited in the night. But it was the size of those eyes that made Blackwood's breath catch in his throat. They were enormous, set at least a foot apart, positioned perhaps 3 or 4 feet above the sand. The light held them for only a moment before the creature turned its head away, but that brief glimpse was enough to send ice water through his veins. The sergeant had grown up in rural Lincolnshire, had hunted since he was a boy, had served in France where he'd seen horses and cattle and every manner of beast in the countryside. He knew animals, knew their shapes and sizes and the way they moved. This was like nothing he had ever encountered. The creature was moving along the beach, heading north parallel to the water's edge. Blackwood tracked it with his torch beam, catching glimpses of dark fur and massive shoulders. Its movement was utterly silent despite the size he could make out in the brief flashes of illumination. The wind and waves created a cacophony of noise, but he heard nothing from the animal itself. No panting, no footfalls, no displacement of sand or rattle of disturbed stones. It simply glided along the beach like something not quite subject to physical laws. What struck him most forcefully was the sheer scale. This was no dog, no matter how large the breed. This creature stood chest high to a man at the shoulder. Its body stretched out to perhaps 8 or 9 feet in length. The proportions were wrong for any canine he'd ever seen. The head seemed too large, the limbs too long. The entire silhouette somehow distorted in ways his trained eye couldn't quite catalog. Blackwood realized his hand was shaking, causing the torch beam to waver. He steadied himself against the concrete wall, forcing his breathing to slow. Years of military discipline kicked in. Observe. Document. Report. These were his standing orders for anything unusual. He watched the creature until it passed beyond the effective range of his torch and vanished into the northern darkness. Then he grabbed his logbook and made his first entry, noting the time as 01:37 hours. But something gnawed at him. This was his stretch of beach, his responsibility. He needed more information. Against standing orders that forbade leaving the observation post during a shift, Blackwood unlocked the steel door and stepped out into the screaming wind. The cold hit him immediately, cutting through his greatcoat. He kept his torch pointed downward as he made his way along the narrow path that led from the bunker down to the beach. His boots crunched on gravel, then sank slightly into sand. The sound of the waves was overwhelming now, great booming crashes that seemed to shake the ground beneath his feet. He swept his torch across the sand, searching. There, just beyond the reach of the highest waves, he found what he was looking for. Tracks. Enormous tracks pressed deep into the wet sand. Blackwood knelt down, heedless of the soaking his trousers were taking. He pulled off his glove and placed his hand next to one of the prints for scale. The paw print, because that's what it appeared to be, was larger than his outstretched hand. He estimated each print measured at least 12 inches across, perhaps closer to 14. The impression showed 4 toe pads, and what might have been claw marks extending forward. The depth of the print suggested tremendous weight, far more than any dog could account for. He followed the trail north, his torch beam revealing print after print in a straight line along the beach. The stride length was impossible, 6 feet or more between impressions. Whatever had made these tracks moved with a gait that suggested both power and terrible purpose. Blackwood followed for perhaps 50 yards until the prints led him directly to the water's edge. And there they stopped, simply vanished. The sergeant stood at the boundary where sand met surf, shining his light across the restless water. The tracks did not curve away along the beach or back toward the dunes. They walked straight into the North Sea and ceased to exist. He searched for another 10 minutes, wider and wider arcs in both directions, but found nothing more. The creature had entered the water and left no further trace. Blackwood returned to his bunker, his mind churning through possibilities and finding none that satisfied. He had seen what he had seen. A massive animal, far too large to be any breed of dog known to exist. Something that moved in complete silence despite its size, whose eyes reflected light like a wolf or a great cat. Something that left tracks bigger than dinner plates before walking into the sea and disappearing. He spent the rest of his shift writing the most detailed report of his military career, filling 3 pages in his precise handwriting. When his relief arrived at 0600 hours, Blackwood personally delivered the report to his commanding officer, fully expecting to be laughed out of the room or accused of drinking on duty. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Morton read the report in silence, then pulled a folder from his desk drawer. Inside were 7 other reports, all from coastal watchers stationed along the Norfolk shore, all describing similar encounters over the past 18 months. Morton had been collecting them, unsure what to do with accounts that seemed to belong more to folklore than military intelligence. 3 of the sightings had occurred during or immediately after German bombing raids on nearby Norwich. 2 others coincided with nights when Allied aircraft had gone down in the Channel, their crews lost. Another had been reported the same night. A British destroyer was torpedoed 12 miles offshore, taking 40 men to the bottom. The pattern, if pattern it was, seemed to connect the creature's appearances with death and violence along the coast. Blackwood learned that locals in the nearby villages had their own name for what he'd encountered. They called it Black Shuck, a devil dog that had haunted the Norfolk shores for centuries. The legend spoke of a harbinger of death, a spectral hound that appeared during times of crisis and catastrophe. The old stories told of glowing eyes, massive size, and the creature's habit of appearing and vanishing without explanation. But legends don't leave footprints in the sand. Legends don't reflect torchlight with physical eyes. Sergeant Blackwood was not a superstitious man. He dealt in observable facts, in things that could be measured and documented. Yet, he had no explanation for what he'd witnessed that October night. No natural animal matched the description. No known species could account for the size and behavior of the creature he'd tracked along that dark beach. For the remainder of the war, Blackwood continued his coastal watches. He never saw the creature again, though he looked for it every night, part of him hoping he would, another part deeply grateful that he did not. When the war ended and the observation posts were abandoned, he returned to civilian life, carrying the memory of those amber-green eyes staring back at him from the darkness, and then the image of those impossible tracks leading into the sea, and simply ending, as if the creature had returned to whatever depths had spawned it, called forth by humanity's violence only to retreat again when its purpose was served. The Suffolk countryside holds its secrets close, wrapped in morning mists that curl through ancient hedgerows and linger over fields that have witnessed centuries of human joy and sorrow. Among the grand estates that dot this landscape, few possess a history as dark and persistently troubled as Clopton Hall, where the line between family legacy and family curse became impossibly blurred through the repeated appearances of a creature that seemed to carry death in its wake. Clopton Hall stood for centuries as a testament to wealth and power, its mullioned windows gazing out across manicured grounds that stretched toward dense woodland on one side, and the crumbling remains of a medieval chapel on the other. The Clopton family, who gave their name to both the hall and the surrounding village, traced their lineage back to the Norman conquest, their roots running as deep into English soil as the ancient oaks that lined their estate. But prosperity and pedigree offered no protection against the darkness that would attach itself to their bloodline, manifesting in the form of a massive black hound whose glowing eyes became synonymous with impending tragedy. The earliest documented accounts of the creature at Clopton Hall date back to the 1700s. though local tradition insists the hauntings began much earlier, perhaps as far back as the dissolution of the monasteries, when the original chapel on the grounds was stripped of its treasures and left to decay. Estate records from 1743 make oblique reference to a persistent disturbance near the chapel ruins, described as a great beast that frightened the horses and caused the groundskeeper considerable distress. The entry is brief, almost dismissive, but it marks the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself with unsettling regularity for the next 2 centuries. What distinguished the Black Shuck of Clopton Hall from other phantom hound sightings across East Anglia was its apparent connection to the family itself. The creature did not simply haunt a location. It haunted a bloodline. Estate workers quickly learned to dread any sighting of the beast, for within days, or at most weeks of its appearance, news would inevitably arrive that a member of the Clopton family had died, whether at home or far away. The Hound became a death herald, a supernatural messenger that announced transitions in the family tree with its burning-eyed presence. In 1812, a footman named Thomas Brackenbury provided one of the first detailed accounts that survives in the family papers. He had been returning to the hall after visiting his sister in the village when he encountered the creature near the entrance to the estate. The evening was clear, he insisted, with good moonlight, and what he saw was no ordinary dog. The animal stood taller than any mastiff he had ever seen, its coat so black it seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. But it was the eyes that transfixed him, eyes that glowed with an inner fire the color of hot coals. The creature regarded him for what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than 30 seconds, before turning and loping toward the chapel ruins with an unnatural gait that made no sound despite its obvious size and weight. Brackenbury reported the sighting to the butler, who received the news with grim acceptance rather than skepticism. 3 days later, word arrived from London that the eldest Clopton's son had been killed in a duel over a matter of honor. The connection was noted in the household accounts, one more entry in a ledger of supernatural occurrences that the family seemed powerless to escape. The mid-1800s brought renewed sightings as the estate passed through several generations of Cloptons in relatively quick succession. A governess employed to teach the Clopton children kept a private diary in which she recorded 3 separate encounters with the phantom hound over a span of 9 years. Each time she saw the creature, she noted, it appeared near dusk, always in proximity to the ruined chapel. Each sighting preceded the death of a family member by less than a fortnight. Her descriptions remained remarkably consistent: an enormous black dog, easily the size of a small pony, with eyes that seemed to burn from within, and a presence that filled her with a dread so profound she found herself unable to move or cry out. The governess noted something else in her diary entries, a detail that would be echoed in later accounts. The creature never approached the living directly. It observed. It watched with those terrible eyes, and then it would turn and make its way toward the chapel, moving with purpose, as if it had business elsewhere, and had merely paused to deliver its silent message to whatever witness happened to cross its path. By the early 1900s, the phantom hound of Clopton Hall had achieved a certain notoriety in the surrounding countryside. Locals avoided the estate grounds after dark, and several servants left their positions, citing the unbearable tension of living in a place where death announced itself through supernatural means. The Cloptons themselves, by this time fully aware of their family's peculiar affliction, seemed resigned to the haunting. They spoke of it rarely, and then only among themselves, as if acknowledging the curse too openly might somehow strengthen its hold. The most detailed and chilling account from this period comes from 1936 and involves a gamekeeper named Walter Simmons, whose encounter with the creature became legendary among those who knew the estate's dark history. Simmons was a practical man, a veteran of the Great War who had seen enough horror in the trenches of France to believe himself immune to fear. He had heard the stories of the phantom hound, of course. Everyone who worked at Clopton Hall knew the tales, but Simmons had never seen the creature himself and had privately dismissed the accounts as superstition mixed with tricks of evening light. That changed on a November evening when he was making his rounds through the estate woodlands. The light was fading, that particular quality of autumn twilight that turns the world shades of gray and gold. He had his rifle over his shoulder and his dog, a Springer Spaniel named Patch, at his heels. They were following a well-worn path through the woods when Patch suddenly stopped, hackles raised, a low whine emanating from his throat. Simmons had never seen the dog behave this way. Patch was fearless around wildlife, trained to flush game birds without hesitation. But now the animal trembled, and when Simmons followed the dog's fixed stare, he understood why. Standing perhaps 50 yards ahead on the path was the largest dog Simmons had ever seen. Its coat was pure black, its proportions all wrong for any breed Simmons could identify. The head was massive, the shoulders impossibly broad. But it was when the creature turned to look directly at him that Simmons felt his confidence evaporate. The eyes glowed with an internal light, a fierce red-orange that reminded him uncomfortably of dying fires. The creature held his gaze for a long moment, and in that moment, Simmons later told anyone who would listen, he felt certain he was looking at something that had no right to exist in the natural world. The creature turned away and began moving through the woods, not fleeing but walking with deliberate purpose. Simmons found himself following, though he could never adequately explain why. His conscious mind told him to turn back, to return to the hall, to pretend he had seen nothing. But something deeper compelled him forward. Patch refused to follow, so Simmons left the terrified dog on the path and continued alone, tracking the massive black shape as it moved through the trees with unnatural silence. The chase, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps 20 minutes. The creature stayed just visible, always ahead, always moving in the direction of the estate's old chapel ruins. As they emerged from the woods, the chapel came into view, its broken walls stark against the darkening sky. The creature headed directly for the chapel's remains, and Simmons, still following, despite every instinct screaming at him to stop, watched as it approached a section of wall that remained relatively intact. The wall was solid brick, part of the chapel's original construction, weathered but substantial. Simmons expected the creature to turn or pause. Instead, it walked through the wall as if the brick were no more solid than morning mist. Simmons approached the wall himself, placing his hands against the cold brick, confirming its absolute solidity. He walked around to the other side. The creature had not emerged on the opposite face. It had simply vanished into the structure itself, leaving Simmons alone in the gathering dark with the certain knowledge that what he had followed was no earthly animal. He reported the incident to the family the next morning. Lord Clopton, the current head of the household, received the news with weary acceptance. 8 days later, his daughter, who had been traveling in Italy, died suddenly of an undiagnosed heart condition. She was 24 years old. Simmons remained at Clopton Hall for another 3 years, but after his encounter, he refused to enter the woods alone after dark. He saw the creature one more time, in 1939, a distant silhouette near the chapel at dusk. The next week, Lord Clopton himself died in his sleep. The family line, already thinned by the wars and by the mysterious ailments that seemed to plague the bloodline, continued its slow extinction. The Second World War brought changes to Clopton Hall, as it did to estates throughout England. Parts of the building were requisitioned for military use, filled with soldiers and equipment. Yet, even with the grounds bustling with activity, reports of the phantom hound continued. A young lieutenant stationed at the hall wrote to his sister describing a massive black dog he had seen near the old chapel, an encounter that disturbed him deeply because the animal had vanished without a trace when he called out to it. 3 weeks later, the lieutenant learned that his cousin, a Clopton on his mother's side, had been killed in action in North Africa. The curse, it seemed, extended even to distant relations. By the 1960s, Clopton Hall had fallen into serious disrepair. The last direct descendants of the family line had died out, and the estate passed through several hands, none of whom could maintain the sprawling property or afford its restoration. Parts of the building became unsafe. The grounds grew wild. Yet, the sightings continued, reported now by trespassers, local teenagers seeking thrills, and occasionally by serious paranormal researchers drawn by the estate's dark reputation. A photographer who visited the ruins in 1972 captured what appears to be a large shadow near the chapel ruins, a dark shape that seems to possess depth and substance despite the image's grain and age. Skeptics have attempted to explain the photograph as a trick of light or a double exposure, but those familiar with the Clopton haunting recognize the size and shape of what the photograph appears to show. What makes the Clopton Hall haunting particularly unsettling is its persistence long after the family itself had vanished. The death stopped naturally, when there were no more Cloptons to die. But the creature remained. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, visitors to the abandoned estate reported encounters with a massive black dog that would appear without warning, observe them with eyes described universally as glowing or burning, and then vanish, often by simply walking through solid objects as if they did not exist. The estate today stands mostly in ruins, the hall itself too far gone for practical restoration, the grounds a tangle of overgrown gardens and encroaching woodland. The chapel, already ruined when the hauntings began, has deteriorated further, its walls barely recognizable as human construction. Yet people still report seeing the creature, particularly on autumn evenings as the light fades. The Black Shuck of Clopton Hall continues its eternal rounds, bound to the estate by forces that transcend human understanding. A death herald with no one left to warn. A curse that outlived the family it was meant to destroy. The fog rolled in from the North Sea each morning in 1974, thick and salt-laden, clinging to the narrow lanes of Overstrand like something alive. This small coastal village in Norfolk had always known the mist, had always understood the particular quality of darkness that settles over communities perched between land and water. But that autumn brought something else with the fog. Something that would transform peaceful streets into corridors of dread and turn neighbors into fearful sentinels watching each other's backs. William Garrett had been delivering mail in Overstrand for 17 years. He knew every gate latch, every loose paving stone, every dog that might bark at his approach. His routine began at 5:30 each morning, sorting letters in the yellow light of the post office before setting out on his rounds, just as dawn began to break. He would later tell the Eastern Daily Press that he had never felt afraid during those early morning walks, not once in all those years, until the morning of October 9, 1974. The lane behind Cromer Road was barely wide enough for a single vehicle, hemmed in on both sides by ancient flint walls topped with moss and brambles. William had turned into this passage as he had done thousands of times before, his leather satchel heavy with the day's post, his breath misting in the chill air. 50 yards ahead, where the lane curved slightly to the left before opening onto the high street, something blocked the path. At first, in the uncertain light, he thought it might be a large dog, perhaps one of the farm animals that occasionally wandered into the village. But as he continued walking, his footsteps slowing despite himself, the shape resolved into something that matched no creature he could name. It stood on 4 legs, that much was certain, but the proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too broad, too heavily muscled. The head, when it turned to look at him directly, was massive and lupine, but the eyes caught what little light there was and threw it back with an amber gleam that seemed to contain its own illumination. William Garrett stood completely still. Later, he would struggle to explain how long this moment lasted. Seconds, certainly, but seconds that stretched and distorted until they felt like minutes. The creature's breathing was audible even at that distance, a low rumbling sound that seemed to resonate in his chest. Steam or vapor rose from its mouth and nostrils in the cold air. Then, without any apparent effort, without any sound of claws scrabbling on cobblestones, it simply rose to its hind legs. Standing upright, the thing must have been close to 7 feet tall. Its front legs, now positioned like arms, hung at its sides, the paws or hands tipped with what looked like dark claws. For a moment that William Garrett would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, man and beast regarded each other in that narrow lane. Then the creature dropped back to all 4s and moved, not away but past him, somehow squeezing along the wall close enough that William could smell it, a scent he described as wet dog mixed with something fouler, something that made his stomach turn. By the time his paralysis broke and he spun around, the lane was empty. The letters he had been carrying were scattered across the cobblestones, and his hands were shaking so violently he could barely gather them up. He finished his route that morning, though he could never remember doing so. When he finally returned to the post office, his supervisor took one look at his face and sent him home. William Garrett, who had weathered storms and illness and personal tragedy without missing a day of work, did not deliver mail again for 2 weeks. The children saw it 3 days later. Overstrand Primary School sat at the edge of the village, its playground bordered on one side by playing fields that gradually gave way to rough grassland and scattered gorse bushes. At morning break on October 12th, 9 children ranging in age from 6 to 10 were playing near the fence that marked the boundary of school property when Susan Woodley noticed something watching them from the tree line, approximately 40 yards away. She would tell her parents that evening that she thought at first it was a big dog, and she had pointed it out to the other children because she loved dogs and wanted to see if it would come closer. But Alice Marsh, who was 8 years old and whose family kept sheep, said immediately that it was not a dog. The way it sat, perfectly still on its haunches, the way its head was shaped, the sheer size of it, all spoke of something else entirely. The children stood in a small cluster, their gaze forgotten, watching the creature watch them. Thomas Barrett, the oldest at 10, later reported that it seemed particularly interested in the smaller children, that its head moved slightly, tracking them when they shifted position. The standoff lasted perhaps 2 minutes before Mrs. Henderson, the teacher on playground duty, noticed the group of children standing motionless and came over to investigate. The moment she approached, asking what they were all staring at, the creature melted back into the undergrowth. Mrs. Henderson saw only the movement of bushes, heard only the crack of a branch, but the description the children gave her, consistent across all 9 witnesses, troubled her deeply enough that she reported it to the headmaster. The fence along that side of the playground was reinforced, and for the first time in the school's history, children were forbidden from playing near the eastern boundary. Reverend Michael Thornton had served as vicar of St. Martin's Church for 12 years. A practical man with a degree in theology from Cambridge, he had little patience for superstition, and had spent more than one sermon gently chiding his parishioners for their attachment to old folk beliefs and pagan traditions. He would later admit, with considerable humility, that his encounter in the churchyard on the night of October 18th fundamentally altered his understanding of what might be possible in the world. He had been working late in the church office, preparing the order of service for a funeral, when he realized he had left his reading glasses in the vestry. The path from the office to the vestry door ran along the south side of the building, through the oldest section of the graveyard where headstones dated back to the 17th century leaned at various angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by salt wind and time. The security light above the vestry door illuminated only a small area. Beyond its reach, the graveyard was a landscape of shadows and pale stone. Reverend Thornton had walked this path countless times in darkness and thought nothing of it. But halfway to the vestry, some instinct made him stop and turn. Among the graves, perhaps 20 feet from the path, something crouched beside the weathered tomb of the Ashford family. The monument was substantial, a table tomb nearly 4 feet high, and whatever rested beside it was tall enough that its back rose above the stone surface. For a moment, Reverend Thornton's rational mind insisted it must be a person, perhaps a homeless individual seeking shelter. He called out, offering help, asking if everything was all right. The head that turned toward him was not human. Even in the poor light, even with his glasses left behind in the vestry, he could see that much. The shape was wrong, the eyes too large and too reflective, the way it moved too fluid and too alien. Reverend Thornton stood frozen, his theology suddenly feeling like a very thin shield against something his education had never prepared him to face. The creature regarded him for what felt like an eternity, then rose and moved away between the headstones, with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. He went back to the office and locked the door. The reading glasses remained in the vestry until morning. In his sermon the following Sunday, Reverend Thornton spoke about humility, about the limits of human understanding, about the possibility that the world contained mysteries that faith and reason together might never fully explain. The congregation, many of whom had heard whispers of other sightings, understood exactly what he was really talking about. But it was the Davis family's experience on the night of October 23rd that truly crystallized the village's fear into something approaching collective panic. Robert and Margaret Davis were returning from Norwich with their 2 daughters, Helen aged 12 and Sarah aged 9, driving along the coast road that linked Overstrand to the larger towns to the south. It was just past 8 o'clock in the evening, full dark, with a thin rain beginning to fall. Robert was driving at a steady 50 miles per hour, the maximum safe speed on that winding coastal route. Margaret noticed it first, a large shape keeping pace with them in the fields that ran parallel to the road. She mentioned it to Robert, more curious than concerned, suggesting it might be a horse, or perhaps a deer, though it seemed to be moving remarkably fast. Then it came closer, leaping a fence with an ease that no horse could manage, and Robert caught a clear view of it in the headlights spill. It was running on all fours, its gait a loping stride that covered ground with terrible efficiency. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the speed creeping up to 55, then 60. The thing kept pace effortlessly, and now it was close enough to the road that they could see it clearly in the peripheral wash of the headlights. Both girls were screaming. Margaret gripped the dashboard with white knuckles. Robert kept his eyes on the road, and his foot pressed down, the car now traveling at nearly 65 miles per hour on a road where such speed was genuinely dangerous. And then the creature did something that would haunt the entire family for years to come. It pulled ahead of the car and crossed the road directly in front of them, close enough that Robert had to brake hard to avoid collision. For just a moment, it was behind them, and in the rearview mirror, Robert Davis saw its eyes. They glowed with that same amber light that William Garrett had described, but seeing them in the mirror, suspended in the darkness behind the car, knowing that this thing was there, right there, following them, was almost more than rational thought could process. Robert accelerated again, the car fishtailing slightly on the wet road, his breath coming in harsh gasps. Margaret was praying, words tumbling over each other. The girls had gone silent, pressed together in the back seat. For almost a mile, the eyes remained visible in the mirror, keeping perfect pace with the car. Then, as they approached the first streetlights marking the edge of Overstrand proper, the eyes simply vanished. There was no sense of the creature falling back or turning away. One moment the amber glow was there, and the next the mirror showed only empty darkness and rain. The Davis family went straight to the police station. The officer on duty, Constable Peter Wright, listened to their account with an expression that Robert Davis described as weary rather than skeptical. He told them they were the fourth family to report a similar experience in the past 2 weeks. The reports, he said, were being taken seriously, though what exactly the police were supposed to do about a creature that could run at 60 miles per hour and apparently vanish at will remained unclear. The following day, the Eastern Daily Press published a detailed article about the Overstrand sightings. The reporter, Janet Holloway, had interviewed multiple witnesses including William Garrett, the children from the school, and the Davis family. Her article was remarkable for its measured tone and its refusal to dismiss the accounts as hysteria or misidentification. She noted the consistency of descriptions across unrelated witnesses, the credibility of the individuals involved, and the genuine fear that had taken hold of the community. The article appeared on page 3, not buried in the back pages with oddities and human interest stories, but presented as legitimate local news. The publication of the article seemed to break a dam of silence. More accounts emerged. A farmer named Edwin Marsh reported finding sheep killed in a manner inconsistent with any known predator, their bodies showing massive trauma, but little evidence of feeding. A couple walking home from the pub claimed they had heard something pacing them in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, its breathing audible, its footfalls heavy enough to feel through the pavement. The atmosphere in Overstrand changed. This was not the slow accumulation of folklore over generations. This was immediate, visceral, and collective. Old residents began to speak of traditions that had been allowed to lapse. Rowan branches appeared above doorways. Horseshoes were rehung with the ends pointing upward. Mrs. Enid Watkins, who at 83 was the oldest resident of the village, gave a talk at the village hall about the old ways, about protective symbols and the importance of thresholds, about the belief that certain things could not cross running water or iron. People stopped walking alone after dark. Those who had to be out after sunset moved in groups, carrying flashlights and walking quickly, their conversations subdued. Children were collected from evening activities rather than allowed to walk home. The youth club meetings were moved to earlier hours. The atmosphere was not quite panic, but rather a kind of sustained vigilance, a collective holding of breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The sightings continued sporadically through November and into December. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature seemed to vanish. The last confirmed sighting was on December 9, 1974, when a motorist reported seeing something large and dark cross the road near the parish boundary. After that, nothing. The fear, however, took much longer to dissipate. Months after the last sighting, people still hesitated before stepping out into darkness. The traditions that had been resurrected remained in place. And in Overstrand, even now, 50 years later, there are those who remember that autumn, who lived through those weeks, when something unknown moved through their community and reminded them that the world still held mysteries that could not be explained away, could not be rationalized, could only be endured and survived. The stretch of road between Sheringham and Cromer, known locally as Black Dog Mile, is unremarkable in every measurable way. 2 lanes of weathered tarmac cut through gently rolling countryside, bordered by hedgerows that have stood for centuries. The road follows the same gentle curves as dozens of other coastal routes in Norfolk. Traffic surveys show no unusual volume. Engineering assessments reveal no structural defects. The gradient is mild, visibility is good, and drainage is adequate. By every objective metric, this mile of the A149 should be indistinguishable from the roads that come before it, and the roads that follow after. But something is wrong with Black Dog Mile. Something that cannot be measured or mapped or explained away by rational minds and careful study. The statistics tell a story that highway engineers cannot reconcile. Between 1970 and 2010, this single mile of road witnessed 23 fatal accidents. By comparison, the 5 miles of similar road on either side recorded a combined total of 4 fatalities over the same period. 23 deaths on 1 mile. 4 deaths on 10 miles. Traffic collision analysts from the Department of Transport visited in 1994, convinced that data collection errors must account for the disparity. They found no errors. They found only a clustering of tragedy so statistically improbable that their report, filed away in government archives, includes a notation that remains unprecedented in British traffic safety documentation. Quote, "No identifiable causative factors present," end quote. That phrase appears 7 times in the 12-page assessment. No identifiable causative factors. No ice in summer crashes. No mechanical failures that explain sudden veering. No alcohol in the victim's blood. No medical emergencies. No distractions. Just death, returning again and again to the same stretch of unremarkable road. But there is something the statistics cannot capture, something that exists only in the statements of survivors and witnesses. Something that appears in police reports written by officers whose professional detachment cracks just enough to let discomfort bleed through. In 17 of the 23 fatal accidents, witnesses reported seeing a dog, not just any dog, a massive black dog, standing in the road, standing where no dog should be. And then the accidents happened. The earliest documented mention comes from 1909, predating the paved road itself. A horse and cart overturned on what was then a dirt track, killing the driver and his 2 children. The farmer who found them gave a statement to the local constable, a statement preserved in parish records. He reported that his neighbor, the deceased, had told him just days before about a black dog the size of a calf that he'd encountered on that same path. The dog had stood motionless in the middle of the track, its eyes glowing red in the beam of his lantern. When the farmer approached, the creature vanished. Not ran away. Vanished. 3 days later, his cart was found splintered against a tree, the horse dead in its traces, foam around its mouth suggesting it had died in absolute terror. The road was paved in 1928. The sightings continue. In 1936, a motorcyclist lost control and struck a telephone pole at a speed that investigators found inexplicably high given the conditions. He survived for 6 hours, long enough to give a statement to the attending physician. He spoke repeatedly of the dog in the road, the enormous black dog that appeared from nowhere. The doctor noted in his records that the man seemed more disturbed by what he had seen than by his fatal injuries. He died still insisting that the creature had not moved, had simply stood there watching as his motorcycle went out of control, as if the machine itself had ceased to obey him. Margaret Ashford was 16 years old when her father died on Black Dog Mile in 1962. She is 77 now, living in a cottage outside Sheringham, and she has spent more than 5 decades remembering what her mother told her about that night. Her father had been driving home from a union meeting in Cromer. The road was dry, visibility was clear, and he knew that stretch intimately, had driven it hundreds of times. But something made him swerve violently off the road and into a drainage ditch. The impact broke his neck. He died instantly. The police found no evidence of another vehicle, no debris in the road, nothing to explain the sudden swerve. but they did find something else. Enormous paw prints in the soft earth at the roadside, prints that measured over 6 inches across. Far too large for any domestic dog. Far too large for anything that should exist in the English countryside. The investigating constable photographed them, included them in his report, and then noted only that, quote, no animal matching these tracks has been identified in the vicinity, end quote. Margaret's mother saw those photographs. She never drove that road again. She would add an extra 40 minutes to any journey rather than pass through Black Dog Mile, and she raised her children with a single unbreakable rule. Never drive that road after dark. Never. The accidents continued through the decades, a slow drumbeat of tragedy that locals learned to expect the way coastal communities expect storms. In 1974, a young couple from London, on holiday. In 1981, a local teacher returning from evening classes. In 1986, 2 teenagers on a motorcycle. The pattern held. Unexplained loss of control. No mechanical defect. No external factors. Just sudden, violent departure from the roadway and the recurring mention in witness statements of something black and massive glimpsed just before the crash. And then came October 3rd, 1988. The date that transformed Black Dog Mile from local tragedy into something that demanded explanation. A family of 4 was driving from a weekend in Norfolk back to their home in Cambridge. The father was at the wheel, his wife beside him, their 2 daughters aged 9 and 11 in the back seat. It was just after 9 in the evening, dark but not late. The other was an experienced driver with no history of accidents or violations. The car was a 3-year-old Volvo, meticulously maintained. The road was dry. Traffic was light. And then, according to the sole survivor, the dog appeared. Sarah Pemberton was 11 years old. She is 46 now, and she has given only 3 interviews in the decade since that night. The most detailed was to a researcher from the University of East Anglia in 2002, and portions of that interview have circulated among those who study such phenomena. Her account has never varied. She remembers looking up from her book and seeing her father's hands tighten on the steering wheel. She remembers the sudden cold that filled the car, so intense that her breath fogged in front of her face despite the heater running. She remembers her mother saying, quote, "What is that?" end quote, the words sharp with confusion and rising fear. And then she saw it. Standing directly in their lane, perhaps 30 yards ahead, caught in the beam of their headlights. A dog. But not a dog. Something far too large, far too solid. Its black fur seeming to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its eyes were not reflecting the headlights as an animal's eyes should. Instead, they glowed from within, a deep burning red that Sarah described as looking, quote, like coals in a dead fire, end quote. Her father braked. The car did not slow. He braked harder, standing on the pedal. The car accelerated. Sarah remembers the speedometer climbing even as her father fought the wheel, his knuckles white, his voice rising in panic as the vehicle stopped responding to him entirely. The engine roared. The steering wheel spun uselessly. And the dog simply stood there, watching their approach, as solid and real as the road beneath them. Sarah's last memory before the impact is of her mother screaming, and the overwhelming certainty that the creature wanted them to see it, wanted them to know, wanted them to understand in their final moments that this was not an accident. The car left the road at 70 miles per hour and rolled 6 times before striking an oak tree that had stood beside that road for 200 years. Sarah's father, mother, and sister died on impact. Sarah survived with a fractured skull and spine and a memory that no amount of therapy or time has diminished. The inquest could find no mechanical explanation. The Volvo's braking system was intact. The accelerator had not stuck. The steering mechanism showed no defects. The official verdict was driver error resulting in excessive speed, but the investigating officer included an unusual addendum to his report. He noted that the skid marks suggested the driver had been braking heavily, not accelerating, and that the pattern of damage was inconsistent with the official conclusion. He noted also that a local farmer had reported seeing an unusually large black dog near the crash site the following morning. The officer concluded his addendum with a sentence that ended his career in traffic investigation. He requested transfer to another division immediately afterward. The sentence read, quote, I cannot, in good conscience, attribute this tragedy to driver error when the physical evidence suggests factors beyond current understanding." End quote. Locals who grew up with the stories of Black Dog Mile were not surprised. They had learned long ago not to speak of such things to outsiders, not to invite the ridicule that follows claims of supernatural phenomena. But among themselves, in the pubs and village halls, they share what they know. They share the rule that Margaret Ashford's mother taught: never drive that road after dark. Never. Those who must pass through do so quickly, windows up, radio on, eyes fixed firmly ahead. They do not look for the dog. They do not want to see it. Because those who see it, those who truly see it, are marked. Something happens to them. Something changes. And too often they do not survive the encounter. Thomas Bright ignored the warnings. In 2003, he was a doctoral candidate at Cambridge, researching folklore and accident causation in rural Britain. He had heard about Black Dog Mile, read the reports, interviewed survivors. He approached the phenomenon with academic skepticism, convinced that the explanation lay in human psychology and the pattern-seeking nature of traumatized minds. He decided to drive the road at night himself, to experience it directly, to prove that an educated mind armed with rationality need fear nothing. He drove the road at midnight on November 14, 2003. He recorded his experience on a digital voice recorder, intending to document his own immunity to superstitious dread. The recording survived. Thomas Bright barely did. The first 11 minutes of the recording are exactly what you would expect. A young academic narrating his journey, his tone lightly mocking, making jokes about ghost stories and rural superstition. He describes the road, the darkness, the hedgerows in his headlights. His voice is confident, dismissive, utterly assured. And then, at the 11-minute mark, his voice changes. The confidence drains away. He says, quote, "It's cold. It's suddenly very cold." End quote. His breath is audible now, sharp and fast. He says, quote, "The heater is on full, but I can see my breath. How is that possible?" End quote. There is a pause. 5 seconds. 10 terror. Then he says, very quietly, almost whispering, quote, oh God, there's something in the road." End quote. What follows is 40 seconds of the most disturbing audio captured outside a death scene. Heavy breathing, a whimpering sound. The engine revving higher and higher. Thomas shouting first in fear and then in panic. Quote, brake, you bastard, stop, why won't you stop?" End quote. The sound of the car leaving the pavement. The recorder tumbling. Impact. Dot. Silence. Thomas Bright survived with severe injuries. 2 shattered legs, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. He spent 4 months in hospital. He never completed his doctorate. He never published his research. And he has never, according to those who know him, driven at night again. The voice recording was provided to police as part of the accident investigation. It was returned to him with a notation that it contained no relevant information. But copies circulate. Those who study Black Shuck have listened to those 40 seconds countless times, parsing every sound, every word, searching for understanding. What they hear is the sound of a rational man encountering something that should not exist, something that stripped away his certainty and left only primal terror. In a follow-up interview conducted by email, Thomas Bright would say only this, quote, "I saw it. It was real, and it wanted me to know it was real. That was the worst part. The knowing," end quote. The road is still there. The accidents continue, though less frequently now. Perhaps because locals have learned. Perhaps because word has spread far enough that even tourists and visitors drive carefully through that mile, though they may not know why they feel compelled to accelerate, to escape, to put distance between themselves and a stretch of road that looks exactly like every other. The Department of Transport has installed additional signage, reduced the speed limit, added rumble strips and high visibility markers. None of it has made a difference. The statistical anomaly persists. The clustering of tragedy continues. And on certain nights, witnesses still report seeing something massive and black standing in the road, watching, waiting, as solid and undeniable as the asphalt beneath its enormous paws. 23 deaths on 1 mile between 1970 and 2010. In the 14 years since, 7 more have been added to that count. 30 fatalities in 54 years on a stretch of road that should claim none. No identifiable causative factors present. That phrase haunts every report, because the truth that cannot be written in official documentation, the truth that exists only in witness statements and whispered warnings and the careful routes that locals plan to avoid that single mile, is that something walks Black Dog Mile. Something that has walked it for over a century. Something that chooses who sees it and who does not. Something that seems to feed on the moment of recognition, on the transition from skepticism to belief, on the final seconds when a rational mind confronts an impossible reality and shatters against it like a car against an ancient oak. The road is still there, the creature is still there, and the accidents will continue, because some things do not require explanation. They require only fear, and Black Dog Mile has an endless supply of both. We return now to the windswept coast of East Anglia, where our journey into darkness began. The same gray waves crash against ancient shores, the same salt-laden wind carries the cries of gulls across desolate marshlands, and the same fog rolls in from the North Sea to cloak lonely country roads in its suffocating embrace. But you are different now. You carry with you the weight of centuries of terror, the accumulated dread of countless souls who glimpsed something that should not exist, and the uncomfortable knowledge that despite everything we have explored together, despite all the evidence and all the testimony, we still have no answers. Stand with me now on Bungay's worn cobblestones, where in 1577 something tore through a congregation at prayer, leaving scorch marks that supposedly lingered for generations. Feel the wave-authenticated historical records describing an event so traumatic it was documented in pamphlets and chronicles, witnessed by dozens of terrified parishioners who watched their neighbors die. Consider the parallel incident at Blythburgh, occurring the same day, where similar marks were left upon the church door, marks that visitors claimed to see until the building's restoration centuries later. Physical evidence, multiple witnesses, documented deaths, and yet, what are we left with? Only questions that grow more troubling the longer we examine them. Why here? Why specifically East Anglia, this particular stretch of English coastline? The question haunts every serious examination of the Black Shuck phenomenon. This is not a legend scattered randomly across the map. The sightings cluster with unmistakable consistency along these eastern shores, from Norfolk down through Suffolk, concentrated in this region with such specificity that it demands explanation. Other parts of Britain have their own folklore, their own spectral hounds and supernatural terrors, but none with this density, this persistence, this overwhelming focus on one geographical area. What is it about these flat, lonely landscapes, these ancient parishes, these windswept beaches that seems to draw forth something dark and massive and utterly inexplicable? Consider the pattern of appearances. Witness after witness, across centuries of sightings, describes encounters that precede tragedy. The creature appears before deaths, before disasters, before moments when the veil between life and what comes after seems to grow dangerously thin. This is not simply folklore embellishment added after the fact. The testimonies are too consistent, too specific, too often documented before the predicted tragedy occurs. How do we explain this? What mechanism could possibly account for a phenomenon that seems to exist partially outside linear time, manifesting as both omen and entity, both warning and threat? And then there is perhaps the most troubling mystery of all, the descriptions. Century after century, from the 1500s through to modern times, witnesses who could not possibly have known about previous sightings describe the same creature. Massive size, often compared to a calf or small horse, eyes that glow with their own terrible light, usually red or yellow or burning green. Shaggy black fur, the sound of enormous paws striking the ground, the sensation of overwhelming dread. These accounts emerge from different villages, different decades, different social classes. We are talking about witnesses before the age of mass communication, before newspapers reached rural villages, before television or internet could spread images and ideas instantaneously. How did a farm laborer in 1700 describe essentially the same entity that terrified a church congregation in 1577? How did they know what to see? The theories attempt to explain but ultimately fail to satisfy. Some researchers propose a residual haunting, a traumatic event so powerful it imprints itself upon the landscape, replaying endlessly like a recording. The land remembers violence, they say, and sensitive individuals perceive these psychic echoes. But this theory crumbles under examination. Residual hauntings, in traditional paranormal research, do not interact with witnesses. They are recordings, nothing more. Black Shuck attacks. It responds to human presence. It chases people down dark lanes. It kills, or seems to kill, leaving real corpses behind. A recording does not tear through church doors or leave scorch marks on stone. Others suggest an interdimensional entity, something that exists in a space adjacent to our own reality and occasionally breaks through. The consistent descriptions, they argue, reflect encounters with an actual being, something real but not of this world. It would explain the physical evidence, the multiple witnesses, the attacks. But then what of the omen aspect? Why would an interdimensional predator consistently appear before human deaths? What possible connection could exist between such an entity and our mortal tragedies? And if it is a physical being from another dimension, why has it never been captured, never been killed, never left behind any biological evidence despite centuries of encounters? The psychological explanations prove equally unsatisfying. Perhaps Black Shuck is a psychic manifestation, a collective fear given form by the human mind's power to create tulpas, thought forms that achieve a kind of semi-independent existence. The isolated, superstitious communities of East Anglia, living in constant proximity to death from disease, storm, and hardship, might have unconsciously created an entity that embodies their terror. This would explain the consistent descriptions. They are all drawing from the same cultural wellspring, the same shared nightmare. But how does a thought form leave claw marks in wood and stone? How does it kill livestock? How does collective fear manifest with such physical consequence? Each theory collapses. Each explanation reaches toward the phenomenon and fails to grasp it fully. We are left with something that refuses to fit neatly into any category our rational minds can construct. It is not simply folklore, not with this much documentation. It is not simply misidentification of natural animals, not with these descriptions and these effects. It is not mass hallucination when witnesses encounter the creature alone, in isolation, with no one to feed their delusion. Black Shuck exists in a space between explanations, too real to dismiss, too impossible to accept, and it continues. Even now, in our modern age of light pollution and surveillance cameras and scientific certainty, the sightings persist. The most recent documented encounters come from within the last few years. Dog walkers on coastal paths, motorists on lonely fenland roads, people who had never heard the legends, who cannot explain what they saw, who are left shaken and changed by an encounter with something massive and malevolent that should not exist but somehow does. Think about what this means. We have spent centuries developing tools to understand our world, instruments to measure and record and analyze. We have satellite imagery that can read license plates from space and particle accelerators that can detect subatomic interactions. We have cameras in nearly every pocket, recording devices everywhere. And yet this thing, this Black Shuck, continues to appear and vanish, continues to terrify and kill, continues to defy every attempt at definitive explanation or capture. Perhaps the most honest answer is the most uncomfortable one. We do not know. After all the research, all the testimony, all the investigation, we simply do not know what Black Shuck is or why it haunts this particular coastline. It remains a genuine mystery in an age that has convinced itself mysteries no longer exist. It is a reminder that for all our advancement, for all our technology and understanding, there are still shadows we cannot illuminate, still things that prowl just beyond the reach of our comprehension. The implications are deeply unsettling. If Black Shuck is real, if something that defies all our categories and explanations can exist, then what else might be real? What other impossible things might be moving through the darkness, just beyond our perception, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves? So as the fog rolls in once more, across these ancient lands, as darkness gathers over marsh and beach and lonely country church, Ask yourself this: what is that sound, barely audible beneath the wind? Is it simply rain on pavement, or could it be something else? Could it be the measured tread of enormous paws, steady and purposeful, drawing closer through the darkness? And that sensation crawling up your spine, that primitive certainty that you are being watched by something ancient and hungry, is that simply imagination, or has your deepest instinct detected what your rational mind refuses to acknowledge? Black Shuck is still out there. Perhaps it always will be. And on nights when the mist hangs heavy and the world feels thin, you might hear them too, those phantom footfalls in the rain, approaching slowly through the darkness behind you. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.